Whether you're all about fun in the sun or rest and relaxation, Volkswagen has SUVs to get you revved up for summer. Have a season packed with adventure in the versatile Atlas with spacious cargo room. Stroll to the sunset in the compact Taos with VW Digital Cockpit. Or make the most of your summer energy in the all-electric ID4 SUV. Get your summer on the road at your local Volkswagen dealer today.
Hey, pull up a chair. It's Hacks on Tap with David Axelrod, Robert Gibbs, and Mike Murphy.
He's also a fundamentally flawed person who engages in reckless conduct and that leads to situations, calamitous situations like this, which are very destructive and hurt any political cause he's associated with. And this was a case that entirely of his own making. He had no right to those documents. The government tried for over a year quietly and with respect to get them back, which was essential that they do. And he jerked them around. And he had no legal basis for keeping them.
Well, there you have it. That is, if you don't recognize the melodious tone, is the voice of Donald Trump's former attorney general, speaking fairly authoritatively on how he views the indictment that came down just a week ago. Usually when we have Hacks on Tap and welcome Hackaroos, it's usually a two-host, one-guest thing. Well, I've been abandoned by both Mike Murphy and David Axelrod. But the good news is we've made more room for more insight. So today, one host, me, Robert Gibbs, and two guests that are going to help try to sort out where in the hell are we? What a crazy week we've had in the last week of politics. But we have for you the incomparable and the always informative Maggie Haberman of the New York Times and Jonathan Martin of Politico. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Robert.
It's been a crazy week. I mean, if you think we're only a week past the whole Trump indictment, Joe Biden had his first rally. We'll get into all of that. We could probably do 3 shows just on Trump's interview with Fox last night. We're going to get into all that. Let's start with Donald Trump. And maybe start with you, Maggie. What do you think is happening right now down in Mar-a-Lago?
Well, it's a great question. I think that Trump is probably feeling very good after his interview with Bret Baier because he looks at everything in terms of PR more than the acid reflux causing answers for his legal team that he gave in that interview. I think that it is underappreciated by all of us, including me, frankly, the extent to which the political campaign is going to be the legal strategy. And I think what's happening at Mar-a-Lago is an effort to try to make Trump as omnipresent in conservative media as possible, and frankly, any media, to basically flood the zone to the extent they can, to run out the clock on the federal legal case to the extent they can, and to try to win the election and then figure out the rest later.
It sounds like they're drawing up plays in the sand, if you will, but fascinating for you to say the political campaign is the legal strategy. I'm gonna pre-apologize to you because when I saw your story a couple of days ago about Trump and his boxes, I kind of giggled. Like, here's this like old man with his boxes, and then I see the clips last night from Fox, and his main defense on having an Iraq war plan is the stuff's in my boxes.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, listen, I appreciate the pre-apology. I only take post-apologies, Gibbs, not I wrote about this because the phrase, the beautiful mind paper boxes, was in a text message in the indictment.
Awesome.
And so I started pulling at what that meant. And indeed it meant, and with my colleagues, and indeed it meant exactly what it sounds like, which is a reference to the book and movie about John, who was he was a Nobel laureate winner, but he was also a paranoid schizophrenic who papered, the walls of his office with newspapers that he believed contained some Russian code that he had to crack. that is going to be Trump's defense. I've never heard somebody say publicly, yes, I didn't respond to a grand jury subpoena because I was too busy. But that was literally his defense to Bret Baier. He did have this obsession with the boxes. He didn't want people going through them. The why of that, Robert, I think we still don't know. I think we still don't know the motive for, why a guy who treats most everything in terms of leverage amassed this amount of highly sensitive government paper. And the government doesn't need to prove that at trial, what the motive is, but I think that's going to hover over everything.
Yeah, and and apparently, these boxes are stuffed with golf shirts, pants, and top secret documents.
Well,
it's really remarkable.
And that is true. I mean, there were all kinds of personal effects in there. We've reported that before. I think it was in the search warrant as well, or the indictment. But But there was also this other stuff, like defense material.
Jonathan, jump in here. What are you hearing about all this? What do you see when you look at the sort of all the connective energy, if you will, kinetic energy, I should say, at Mar-a-Lago?
Yeah, I mean, Maggie has said this before, but for Trump, I mean, legal strategy is almost always PR strategy, and they're kind of indistinguishable. And so I think that's forever the case, and certainly is now. I don't think Donald Trump wants to gamble with a jury of his peers. I think he'd rather gamble with the political process in America. And there's 3 scenarios. He becomes president, another Republican becomes president, or a Democrat becomes president. And, you take those odds that 2 of those 3 scenarios, he probably is getting a pardon. And I think if you're Donald Trump, you delay, you try to get this thing pushed down the road, and you hope that the election turns out in your favor. If not you, then someone in your party. And then you exert enormous pressure on whoever is president to give you a pardon. It does put the party in an extraordinarily difficult position. Nothing new, by the way, in the era of Donald Trump, right? I mean, they bought the ticket, they're taking the ride, and they have been ever since 2015. It's basically a subsidiary of Trump right now. And I think most Republicans are fine with that, generally in the rank and file. But what that entails is, the next year and a half is going to be extraordinary in American politics, because you're going to have either a nominee, or at least a former president who is, actively in the market for a pardon.
It's remarkable that we can still be surprised or shocked, or this idea of just how crazy the next year is going to be after we've been through 6, 7, 8 of these years already. And thankfully we've got sort of 2 kind of newsy bits that happened before we started recording. Usually this happens right after we stop recording. But I was fascinated by, there's been a lot of criticism about the judge overseeing this trial in Florida, a Trump appointee, some pretty nice pro-Trump rulings that were overturned earlier in some of this. But she scheduled an August 14th trial date. And that's not August 14th, 2024. That's August 14th, 2023. Obviously, now we're going to go into the sort of tried and true Donald Trump, 4 corners offense of just trying to wind down the clock. But I was certainly surprised, and she's clearly trying to get out in front of this narrative that she's dragging her feet here. Remarkable too. I mean, Maggie, that's 9 days. Again, may not hold, but 9 days before the first Republican debate this summer. Trump's going to have to get some time off from the trial just to make the debate,
if he wanted to go to the debate, which I think is an open question. But I don't actually think that this trial is going to start on August 14th. I think that she was setting an aggressive schedule so that she is not accused of being the reason why this slows down. Right? I think you are now going to very instantly see the Trump team file a bunch of motions trying to delay it. The other piece too is his lawyers need security clearances in order to move ahead, because this evidence is classified and they don't have them. So now there's one lawyer working on the case who probably will end up with a clearance, but I don't anticipate that August is a realistic time frame. But I do think it clarifies thinking a bit on just what this overlap between not just this trial, Robert, but the others he is facing. He's facing one in Manhattan in March of 2024. He's facing a civil trial in the E. Jean Carroll case in January. He is facing a civil case from the New York Attorney General. I think it's in October of this year. And there are still one, if not two more indictments that may come against him in connection with his efforts to remain in power. So I think it just clarifies the fact that, to your point, I don't think it'll be true in August, but it will be true at some point. But there's going to be some conflict between his political calendar and the judicial calendar.
I was struck watching watching some of the clips last night from the Fox News interview. We sure are a long way away from those softball Hannity interviews where Trump gives a marginally good answer and then Hannity tries the second time to give him a better answer. And then the Bret Baier interview felt almost hostile. And I don't know whether that's them trying to prove this or it felt it felt different, at least, than some of the stuff I've seen before. What do you both think of that?
I would like to know what Jonathan thinks. I just want to push back a little bit on that. I didn't think it felt hostile. I thought it was really professional. I think Jonathan Swan remains the gold standard for a TV interview with Trump, for the one he did in 2020 when he was at Axios. But I thought this was really good, and I thought that the questions were tough without being hectoring.
Yeah, no. Let me clarify, because that's a smart point. I don't mean hostile in the sense that I thought Bret was overbearing or didn't. I mean, I thought he asked everything that you would normally want in an interview or almost expect in an interview. I guess I said hostile because I don't really expect that from Fox News in dealing with Donald Trump.
Bret is known as a straight news reporter, and so I think that's not surprising. But I think that I think this interview had been in discussions for a while, from what I've heard from people around Trump, and I think that it was made pretty clear that it was not going to be a softball, and it wasn't. I mean, listen, he also let Trump, say his piece, right? He wasn't cutting him off every 5 seconds.
Right.
But there was, in addition to the stuff that was related to the indictment, there was that bit where Baier was reading off the list of former officials who worked for Trump, and then said, "Why did you hire them?" Which was a great question. Yeah,
kind of brutal. What, Jonathan? I hesitate to enter this into the equation because I'm as critical of national polling in a presidential primary as anybody on the planet. But I am struck by the fact that we are a week on from the indictment, and doesn't look like Trump is any weaker. Doesn't look like, quite frankly, he might, quite frankly, be stronger. 80% of Republicans think these indictments are political. Is this a help to anybody besides Trump?
The short, dodgy answer is we don't know yet. Look, I think one of two things are happening here. One is events don't matter as much to American politics, and that's like hard to grasp for people that cover politics or who have worked in politics or who edit coverage, Maggie, of coverage of politics. That like, whether it's Biden getting the debt ceiling deal or falling down on stage at the Air Force Academy, like his numbers don't really move. And whether it's like Donald Trump does or does not have indictments within the Republican primary, like his numbers don't really move. And so I that's because events don't matter that much anymore, and we're kind of largely stuck with where we are, and people have a fixed view. Or there's something else happening, which is that voters aren't being totally honest with pollsters about their actual views. And I'm not totally sure. I tend to believe it's more the first than the second, especially with Biden. I think with Trump, I think that there is almost like a social penalty among Republicans for saying what you actually think about Donald Trump, especially to a pollster or to a reporter. Because if you condemn him, then you're using the same language that his opponents use, and that's kind of a faux pas. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So I think we're dealing with two different questions here, which is, are you open to supporting somebody else? They may be more open to saying yes. If they're asked more specifically about Trump, they're more reluctant to say that he's a bad guy or did a bad thing, because that's what the other side says and does. I'm sure this happened to Maggie 1,000 times. Anytime you're talking to voters about Trump, if they're Republicans, even if they don't like him anymore, they're not going to vote for him again. They will still start their answer with some version of the following: I liked the policies, ... Or I voted for him twice, ... Because they want to like preemptively make clear that they're still like Republicans. They're not haters.
Right.
But then they'll go into why they're not for Trump this time. I just say all that because I think that there's a reluctance to say out loud, if you're a Republican voter, that you want to move on from Trump or that you condemn Trump, even more to the point.
I think that's totally true. I also just think, but I do think that your point about how much politics is now defined by who you hate and who hates you back. And that's even true in that answer that you just described about what Republicans say. I just think that's such a driving factor.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm still of the belief that Iowa's going to be a huge determinant here. New Hampshire is certainly going to be a huge determinant here. I mean, I think you all have both covered. I've certainly worked in enough of these campaigns to see how quickly the national polling will turn once we have a result from those two places. I do wonder, if this, I was thinking about this morning, is some of this at least potentially good for somebody like a Ron DeSantis, who is maybe has a little bit more of a period to kind of keep his head down, figure out how to make this whole campaigning thing work, get out on the stump, get out and talk to people, maybe without the normal kind of scrutiny where, everybody's got a stopwatch on how many seconds he speaks to each voter and whether he connects and all this kind of stuff. He had a big event in Nevada over the weekend, and I just wonder if does it give? I mean, obviously Trump's going to be blocking out the news, but does it give these guys a little bit of on the ground cover to go, get their campaigns going?
It's a good question. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'm thinking through what you just asked, whether the indictment gives some cover for them.
Well, I don't know if it's the indictment. It just feels like, Trump is, as he does, blocking out the national press sun.
Oh,
and I tend to believe
saying. Whether there's a stealth operation that can take place, basically. I mean, look, I think DeSantis and Tim Scott are frankly most in the position to do that. If anyone is, I do think there is a window for it. I think that we're in this weird sort of nether space up until the first debate. And I think that's what's going to potentially create a moment for any of these guys. I do think that there is, there's a lot of work that's being done by the DeSantis super PAC in Iowa on the ground. The Trump folks have fired back at them for astroturfing. There's been, at least in some public polling, some movement by Christie in New Hampshire, although, some campaigns have questioned whether it's actually that much. But that's, I think, solidifying some of the anti-Trump vote because DeSantis isn't really making a play for them. I do think there's some room, Gibbs. I'm so skeptical about how soft the ground is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if that's the case, and this is for both of you, if Trump freezes everything, then, it doesn't seem like there's much of a lane for all that many people. Maybe DeSantis. You mentioned Tim Scott. He seems to have a decent amount of money. He's got a forward-looking message in a way that I think others don't. But I'm struck by, Donald Trump spent a lot of time in that Fox interview last night. The answer he gave about the election being stolen is not at all different than what he gave a week after the campaign. And, here we are 2+ years later fighting something that, I think maybe his people believe. I don't even think he believes it, but some of his supporters believe. And it just, if that's the case, does everything just get frozen? And to your point, Maggie, what unsticks it? Is the next big moment, at least outside of a courtroom, is this debate in August? And you mentioned, and again, both of you hop in here, but what are you looking for in that? Who has to make a good impression? Obviously, you've got a lot of time to deal with that. And do you think Trump shows up? Jonathan?
I think Trump will make a judgment in part based upon the reaction to last night's interview. I think if the coverage and his feedback from his friends and allies is that Brett was overly hostile I would say aggressive, then I think maybe he'll be inclined to send it out. Look, Trump has sat out debates before, right? This would not be unheard of. So that it wouldn't shock me if he sat it out. I think the temptation to be there to defend yourself on stage is certainly going to be tempting for him, but he also doesn't want to do Fox any favors at this point.
Yeah.
Jonathan's totally right. I'm all over it.
I can see a scenario here where there is a critical mass of Republicans who are against Trump, who don't want Trump to be the nominee again in 24, who, divide their vote in Iowa, but still close enough, Robert, to where Trump takes on some water. In Iowa, he either wins narrowly or loses narrowly. I think the challenge is, and I'm thinking about this watching Christie's first couple of weeks on the campaign trail. I just think Republicans are going to have a problem because the top challenger to Trump in Iowa, I think, is going to be different than the top challenger to him in New Hampshire. And we've seen the movie before. And I think that the calendar could create a challenge for Trump's opposition. Trump supporters aren't going anywhere. And, if you don't have a clear-cut opposition, he's going to take advantage of that. And, you tell me today, Robert, who's the Republican that can beat Trump in Iowa and New Hampshire? I don't know if there's one.
I don't think there's one. Yeah, to your point, I'm always struck by the fact that, Trump didn't win Iowa in 2016.
Yeah.
And so it certainly seems like there's a path. If I was running a Republican campaign, by the way, none of the Republicans want me to run their campaign, but if I was running a campaign right now, I would probably camp out in Iowa because I tend to believe if Trump wins in Iowa, I don't see how he gets stopped. Maybe you hope that Iowa or New Hampshire becomes the contrarian to Iowa, which is a role it's played throughout its political history. But I think if they let Trump keep the momentum or get the momentum coming out of Iowa, I think it just gets a lot harder to stop. And I think, that's where I would go park it if I was trying to upset him, because to your point, I think there's a lot of people that are Trump supporters or potential Trump supporters that just don't see, or there's just no real evidence to move from him. And my God, if you're still with him after all this, I'm not sure what exactly. I don't think it's something some Republican says on a stage that makes you go, oh boy, I never really contemplated that. Boy, this whole thing is just not going to work. I think to some degree, I think you may have a DeSantis or somebody else who's waiting for Mike Pence to try to blow him up, or more likely Chris Christie to try to blow him up. And then sort of, does that create a lane where two people are fighting and I go get some of that support and try to consolidate some of it. But I would park myself in Iowa. I would do a lot.
And Robert, if you do that and you're Mike Pence or you're Tim Scott or Ron DeSantis, and you put up a nice number in Iowa, but you don't touch New Hampshire, and then Chris Christie is sitting in New Hampshire and gets 25% of the vote and winds up finishing number 2 to Trump in New Hampshire, like Kasich did in 2016.
Right.
Then what do you do?
Yeah. Well, then that's a good. It's a good.
You go
point.
to South Carolina, right? Yeah.
Right. Or Nevada, South Carolina. I think the challenge is, to me, and you've got the point, which is, unless it's one person who has enough strength to do it everywhere, if it's a few people doing it, that means there's nobody to coalesce behind. Maybe Trump, and then maybe Trump gets to a point where, when it's winner take all, it's back to the 2016 scenario of him accruing delegates at a much faster pace because nobody else is stopping him. What are we missing, Maggie?
No, I don't think you're missing anything. I think both things are true. I think that your point that, you would camp out in Iowa has been how some of these folks are looking at the race. DeSantis is not going to say that he's camping out in Iowa, but I think that's basically what he's going to do in large measure, even though he's going to have, a very well-funded campaign and a better funded super PAC that can bolster him going forward. He's really the only one who's in that position. I do think you're going to see Mike Pence camp out in Iowa. His folks have made that pretty clear. Scott Reed, who was running the super PAC before Pence became a candidate, said they were going to run him through, all 99, like he's running for county sheriff or state, whatever, sheriff of Iowa. So I think that is what you're going to see. But I think that Jonathan is right, that it's just going to create this bifurcation where no one consolidates the anti-Trump vote. But the anti-Trump vote is so disparate, right? It's like, it's combined of people who they're hardcore never Trumpers. It's also people who, as Jonathan was describing earlier, like the policies, but want to move on and are tired of the drama. It's people who, want to see a sort of a younger model, but want the movement to continue. And there is no one candidate who's appealing to all of them. DeSantis is, I think, trying the hardest to be that candidate. But in doing that, he is forfeiting certain opportunities, right? So you could see a world where a DeSantis, a lawyer and governor would say, after this latest indictment, some version of what Mike Pence said, which is, I can't defend the facts, and as stated in that indictment. And DeSantis is not doing that at all. DeSantis is clearly afraid of disturbing the dust around his coalition. It's just not clear how long that can congeal.
Yeah, Robert, I think that your point about DeSantis sort of using this moment to buy some time and try and figure out where things land. Yeah, and I think he's trying to sort of groping in the dark right now, looking for the light, because if you can't run a frontal attack against a frontrunner who's been indicted on 37 counts, we're in pretty uncharted territory, right? And if you're the guy who's trying to catch up to the frontrunner and you can't whack them for like 37 indictments, it's a difficult moment. And it sort of speaks to where the Republican Party is. And maybe, by the way, maybe you can't find the light in the dark. It's just impossible. And I think that's certainly a possibility. And by the way, that's what a lot of people concluded, named Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, Mike Pompeo, Rick Scott, who took a pass and didn't run. That it just ain't worth it. It's not happening, right? But so we'll see if that's the case. Reckless speculation here, guys. I kind of wonder if I'm all for it.
We're here for that. That's our.
I kind of wonder if DeSantis around Labor Day, maybe even Halloween, does not decide that his better bet is to do an Iowa, Nevada, South Carolina move, or even, Iowa, South Carolina, and just back out of New Hampshire, or at least downplay New Hampshire. I think that runs the risk of, the bifurcation of letting two different people emerge from the first two states. But I kind of wonder if he will decide that South Carolina is going to be the more consequential, a la Democrats in 2020 this time around. That's going to be the one that really vaults whoever is the nominee, and that New Hampshire just isn't that representative because independents can vote. So you got a lot of people who are unaffiliated or even Democrats playing, and he's better off, taking a win out of Iowa, getting the big mo from that, and then planting his flag in states in Nevada and South Carolina that are much more traditionally conservative.
Yeah. Now, New Hampshire doesn't feel quite like it fits where he's going to go or he wants to go. And Lord knows we've seen particularly candidates that appeal to evangelical voters on the Republican side in Iowa come out and find themselves on shakier ground when they get into a place like New Hampshire. We're going to take a short break, and now a word from our sponsors. I bet a lot of our listeners out there have a dog or many dogs. I know Murphy's got a dog. I know Axe has a dog. I think Axe is more concerned about that dog and the dog's well-being than he is his own, which is like a lot of us. And if you have a dog and you love your dog, then you're worried about what your dog eats every day. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Maeve, because maybe your dog is a picky eater. Maybe your dog scratches a lot. Maybe he just or she just doesn't kind of jive with the food that you are trying to feed him or her. Well, there's good news, because if you're like all of us and all the hacks want the best for our dogs, maybe you feed them kibble recommended by a vet or a fresh food diet. But did you know that these are often low in protein, high in carbs, and are the leading cause, pay attention here, of weight, mobility, dental, and skin conditions for your dogs? Who wants that? Nobody wants that for your dog. That's where Maeve comes in. Your dog is biologically primed to digest and absorb key nutrients from an unprocessed, low-carb, high-protein, raw meat diet. And Maeve's raw food diet is formulated, most importantly, to meet your dog's needs. They don't need a lot of processed kibble. They want unprocessed, high protein, low carbs. All right? That's what you're getting with Maeve. They support benefits that you can smell and feel and see. Your dog will have better breath. They'll stop itching as much. They'll stop shedding as much. It'll be easier for them to do their thing when you're out walking. And most importantly, they'll maintain a healthy weight. Most dog parents will see results in 28 days or less. There's no mess, no prep, no thawing. You just open, pour, and serve. Your dog will enjoy it. It's just that easy. So make the switch to Raw today. Right now, Maeve is offering $40 off your first order at meetmaeve.com/hacks. Go to meetmaeve, MAEV.com/hacks. Let me spell that again. That's spelled MEETMAEV to receive $40 off your first order. That's meetmaeve, MAEV.com/hacks. Your dog will love it. Let's talk a little bit of the Democratic side. Let's start, Jeff, if you can play a little sound from Joe Biden's first re-election rally last weekend in Philadelphia.
Folks, I'm looking forward to this campaign. I want you to know why. Because you've got a story to tell. We've got a story to tell. We've got a record to run on. And most importantly, we're not only changing this country, we're transforming it. We've created 13 million new jobs since I became president. That's more jobs in a little over 2 years than any president's created in one 4-year term. The unemployment rate is down to nearly a 50-year low at 3.7%. I've seen record lows for black employment and Hispanic unemployment as well. We've created 800,000 manufacturing jobs.
So there was President Biden in Philadelphia, a heavy dose, if you watched any of it, of economic populism, a room of organized labor as he was accepting lots of organized labor endorsements and juxtaposing working people and investment bankers. I thought that was not subtle. Be interesting on the fundraising trail in the next 2 weeks to walk people through those. But let's. I want to get to where we think his campaign is. But again, the other part of a little bit of breaking news, again, thank you to the judicial system for making it before we recorded today. Hunter Biden is pleading, and I think I have this right, to some misdemeanor tax charges, as well as a gun charge. It put him into, I think it's a diversion program. He has to stay drug-free for a couple of years, but avoids jail time, avoids, quite frankly, what Donald Trump's about to be fully enmeshed in, which is a criminal trial. And it's unclear to me. I mean, Hunter Biden's lawyer said that he believed that this closed any of the investigations on his client. I don't know that we've seen that from prosecutors yet. But Maggie, how significant is the news around Hunter Biden and how, I mean, obviously we have to throw it in with what's going on with Trump and what the Republicans are going to do around this as well.
In a normal world, Robert, the son of a sitting president, pleading guilty to charges, even though I think that at least 2 of them are misdemeanors, would be a big deal. In the world in which the former president was indicted on charges, one stemming from the Espionage Act a week and a half earlier, it feels smaller. And I think you're going to see Republicans argue that. They're already arguing it, that it somehow argues that there's a 2-tier justice system, despite the fact that these are 2 very different cases. And Hunter Biden pleaded guilty, which, Donald Trump is emphatically not doing. But I think that it just adds to this sense of instability around this race as we go forward. I imagine for President Biden personally, this is very distressing, given how close he is to his son. And I don't know what that ends up looking like. I don't think Democrats want to have to talk about this or want to have to deal with it. I think Jonathan might have better insight on that than I do. But it just adds another dimension of chaos into this race.
Just what we need.
Right. It was so calm before this. So
right. It was just another boring Tuesday over here in campaign land. Jonathan, so Biden's out there. He's, by all accounts, in reading some of the stories, the curtain raising stories to his first event, there's a lot of anecdote of, Joe wanted to wait maybe until the fall to start this. And, no rush to do this, but clearly there is a lot that you have to put together. Where do you, if you're assessing the atmosphere and assessing where Biden is with his campaign right now, where do you see that? Where do you see Democrats and why the importance of doing what he's doing now?
Well, I think Bidens are probably distressed to see the fact that their surviving son is facing charges, even if it is a misdemeanor. It's obviously not a great day for any parent. But I'm guessing that there's some measure of relief that's not more serious. Look, the person who pursued this case was a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney.
Right.
Of course, it's not going to be satisfactory to the Republicans who are screaming that there's not equal justice here. They're going to want more. They're going to say that they're ignoring the larger conspiracy going on here. I guess this is where I have to chuckle a little bit, and both of you guys will appreciate this because we've been doing this as long as we have, is there's this assumption that everything is so organized, like the Republican instinct of saying, oh, well, this was obviously a deal. And that after they went after Trump on the classified documents, they had to do this because this will make them seem more fair. And of course, Biden himself was pulling all the strings from the West Wing. It's like, do you guys not know how government works? Like, it's not remotely that organized. And
what are you talking about? It's highly organized. It's very structured.
Somebody who Maggie and I know well, and who's a mentor to both of us, John Harris, has this great expression that each party believes the other is uniquely sinister and organized and just ruthless. And you see this all the time now when it comes to the Republicans with Biden. Is he is simultaneously barely coherent and has got early onset Alzheimer's, but at the same time is running the most extraordinarily efficient, dastardly, politicized DOJ in American political history. It's well, guys, which of those two is it? Because it's hard to see them doing both.
Right.
And I just laugh, Robert, because it's that's not how government is. It's not remotely this well organized, and frankly, nothing is. And it's just a fantasy. Anyways.
To your point, half the time they say he's incoherent, doddering, falling down, can't stand up, can't find his way, off the stage or on the stage. And yet when the cameras are off, he's deeply Machiavellian and pulling all of the strings. It is interesting that I'm not sure those two images line up altogether well. But I was struck. I think, first of all, just having Biden out on the stump is important. I think having the campaign, having to have him out on the stump is important, right? I think there's a muscle exercise that I don't think people understand, even if you're in the White House. It takes a long time. To your point around the structure of organization, the same goes for campaigns, right? Yeah. You've got a lot that has to get put together. There's a lot of money that has to get raised. Here we are, what is this, the 20th of June. The first fundraising deadline's in 10 days. There will be heavy, heavy scrutiny for a sitting president to show a pretty big fundraising number. There's the structure again. You have to build a field organization. You have to build. They don't even have. I don't think they even have an office yet. So there's a lot of, I think, unsettledness here. And I was struck just having been in Washington the last few days. I've heard more conversation about no labels and third-party candidates than I have in a long time. And so part of what I want to discuss here is, and I guess my first question before I get to no labels, because I've got two great reporters, and I'm going to ask you this question. If Robert Kennedy Jr. is on the ballot in Iowa and New Hampshire, and Joe Biden isn't on the ballot in Iowa and New Hampshire, and RFK Jr. wins both of those, your editor says Maggie, Jonathan, what's the news story value? Your answer is blank.
I think that the question will be different. I think the question that the news editors everywhere will be asking is Biden in trouble? And while I think the answer is that Biden will be fine as the nominee, I don't think this is something that his advisors or his campaign wants to deal with. I don't think this is a headache that, I've spoken to Biden folks who have been predicting that, RFK could end up with overall about, 20%. And
he's at that in some polls right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's not, again, it's not enough to change the race, but it is enough to suggest weakness on the part of the incumbent president. There is a reason, and Robert, you know this very well, there is a reason that Trump's people in 2020, in the preceding 2 years, his advisors, Justin Clark and Bill Stepien, worked very hard to try to stave off any oxygen that a Republican challenger could get in a primary, even though it was largely going to be symbolic. It's just that that's how you start to show weakness and how dominoes start to fall. So, I think the stories will write themselves. I think the question is whether they impact the outcome. And I don't think they will. But to Jonathan's point from earlier in the show about what a closely divided country this is and how everybody's just in their entrenched camps, the RFK vote, it seems to me, and Robert, you're much smarter on this than I am, but seems to me represents a fair number of disaffected Democrats who are waging a protest vote. And, what that looks like in terms of whether they come back in a general election, I think is a big question.
I think a lot of the vote is just now either because his name's Kennedy or because he's not Joe Biden.
That's right.
There's plenty of Democrats who want somebody else to run that's not named Joe Biden. Look, I think it's going to be really embarrassing, Robert, when the New Hampshire primary, which has been covered intensely as the first in the nation primary for over a half century, comes back with a return that shows Robert Kennedy or somebody else defeating the sitting president of the United States. I know what the pre-spin's going to be and the post-spin's going to be. Biden didn't file papers. He was not on the ballot. It doesn't matter. It doesn't count. That vast majority of Americans who don't follow politics that closely know that New Hampshire is New Hampshire, and they're going to see Biden lost. What happened?
Exactly.
So it's going to be, I think, a difficult couple of days. And look, Kennedy is just a symptom for this larger issue of there's plenty of Democrats that don't want Biden to be their nominee. And I know that it is expected among sort of Democratic elected officialdom that you have to salute and fall in line and you have to be for Biden because Trump's knocking at the door again or banging at the door. But the problem is that there's a lot of rank and file Democrats who don't want Biden to run again.
That's right.
And will they vote for him if he's the option against Trump? Of course, the vast majority of them will. But Robert, that's a different question than wanting Biden to be the nominee again.
Yeah, look, I think for what he's facing right now, you both of you touched on this. Like if this was Robert Smith Jr., we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? The last name is Kennedy. There's a love affair in the Democratic Party, rightly so, with a family that produced 3 senators and a president. So there's that. I think, and I wonder, Maggie, your point, whether these are really disaffected Democratic voters or not, I think is an interesting question. I tend to believe why I think this is ultimately going to be a pain in the ass and a nuisance, but not anything other than a pain in the ass is I just don't think I don't think anti-vaccine Dems is nearly the sort of bubble size that you would need to cause real kind of consternation, right?
No question about that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right. If this was an ideological, you go back in history, you see Pat Buchanan, waging a deeply ideological primary that wounds George H.W. Bush in such a significant way. And so I think in some ways it's markedly different there. I don't disagree that this is going to be, again, a nuisance, something they're going to have to deal with. It's going to take up some news cycles.
Does this open the door, though? And does Kennedy even getting the traction that he's getting? And I take it, and you're right. Now, a lot of it is the last name, and some of it is just a placeholder. But here's my question. Does the traction that he is getting, with all those caveats, does that encourage somebody else to get into the race?
Right. I've been wondering the same thing.
That's not an anti-vaxxer, that is more of a mainstream Democrat.
See, I think the challenge with that is if I think in this sense, Biden is actually, they have done a good job, and he is stronger in this sense, that they've basically let enough people know that he is that he's politically strong enough, even as you've seen some of these polls. And to your point, you show people in a focus group, they may not love him when it's just, hey, do you want him to be the nominee? And then you say, hey, Joe Biden versus Ron DeSantis, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. Like, the line gets pretty sharp. That's like, everybody's in line and they're ready to go. I think the challenge is, if you were a Gavin Newsom or, somebody else, if you ran against Joe Biden as a sitting president, if you didn't beat that person, basically your political career is over. And I don't think there's anybody on the Democratic side that's willing to put those kind of chips in the middle of the table. And it's much easier to get behind the sitting Democratic president than it is to sort of risk your political career. I will say this, if I was, and I talked about this as we led into this, I'd be far more concerned about the practical impact of either this weird no labels third party business, or I'm going to say this, I hate to give this any oxygen, but if Cornel West runs as the Green Party nominee and they're on enough important states, and just keep in mind, Cornel West and Kanye West, neither of them is going to be president of the United States, right? But in reality, to impact the race, they don't need to be president. If the Green Party's on the ballot in 6 states and he pulls any kind of numbers, you got problems, right? I mean, we all know this. 2,537 votes in Florida and 100,000 Ralph Nader votes.
How about 2016, where,
right,
you had Jill Stein on the Green Line, and then you had, I can't even remember, was it Gary, there was another
Gary Johnson.
Gary Johnson, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it was a not insignificant portion of the vote in a number of states. So, I do think that is a condition that it's somewhat ripe for this time, depending on who we're talking about.
Right.
And I know that is of concern to a number of Democrats who believe that it would pull disproportionately from Democrats than from the Republicans.
Robert, I think it's possible that we could have like a 4-way race where you have a sort of Cornel West taking, like, not a lot, but the sort of some disaffected folks on the far left, especially those under the age of 30. Right. And then you could have some kind of a moderate who just is giving folks somewhere to go that can't stomach the Trump or Biden option again.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm struck. Some of this no label stuff that's floating around, this polling that says they can win 25 states and 280 electoral votes. And if there's a poll that legitimately says that, I would advocate for an immediate drug test of that pollster, because that's just not happening. But to your point, Maggie, your example is better than mine because it's much closer. And that is, this is a race that's going to be decided in 5 or 6 states, by a handful of votes. And by handful, we mean just, a few thousand in some of these places. Giving somebody any other place to go is something that's going to keep a lot of people up at night. It's just going to cause a lot of consternation. It's going to your point, it just adds to this idea. It is chaos 2024 in kind of every way, shape, or form. And now, a word from our sponsors.
Tracksmith, my favorite running brand, has opened its first New York City store at 147 Wythe Avenue in Brooklyn. If you're a runner or anyone who appreciates first-class athletic gear, this is the best news ever. Amazing trainers, running apparel designed by real runners, all with the finest material and classic style. I'm wearing, as I'm reading this, no fewer than 3 Tracksmith pieces. You can shop their summer collection at 147 Wythe Avenue or shop online at tracksmith.com.
What is the biggest short-term political imperative for Joe Biden? We're past the debt ceiling. I'm trying to waste some time so you can think of your very smart answer. We're past the debt ceiling, which seemed to be the kind of immediate cliff that was really disconcerting. In many ways, the news today that Hunter Biden is not going to end up in a courtroom other than to plead guilty and not go to jail, that seems a bit off the map now. What is the biggest short-term political imperative for Joe Biden to be successful come November of 2024?
That's a great question.
I'll start.
Please.
Yeah, Maggie just was motioning off camera to ask Jonathan.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gesturing in J Mart's direction. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
I say this with a total straight face.
All right.
Not falling anymore and not having senior moments. I'm totally serious about this.
Yeah.
The most damaging thing to Biden's prospects in terms of A, warding off a more serious Democratic primary challenger, and B, in terms of winning the general election a year and a half from now, is not being perceived as too old for the job. I mean, that is the challenge he has, is that his numbers don't move, in part, I think, because there's plenty of people in this country who just think he's not up for the job anymore, and they want somebody else because they don't think he's capable of doing the job, or certainly isn't for 5 more years. And I think anything that reinforces that notion, Robert, I think is just terrible for him.
I think that I would just go with whatever he can to keep the economy from sagging. I mean, I think those are the two biggest issues for him: the perceptions about his age, and they're not perceptions. He's the oldest president we've ever had, but the perceptions about his abilities, along with the economy. I think that if either of those is a problem for him in the fall, I think of 2024, I think he has real issues. But I think J Mart's correct. It's not just the short term, but frankly, in the long term. One thing that I know concerns Democrats a lot is the idea that there will be some incident in the fall of 2024, and that would be a risk to Biden.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, the administration got some relatively good news on inflation last week. We used to, Ax and I would hurriedly look at the employment report when we were in the White House. I can imagine they're looking at consumer price index on a monthly basis and tuning in with some regularity to Chairman Powell's news conferences on whether or not they're going to raise interest rates. Let's do a couple of things. We've started a book club. I know you think maybe Murphy can't read, but we have a book club. It's hacksontap.com/book club. And we ask our guests, give us something good to read that our listeners would enjoy. Can be nonfiction, fiction, politics, can be whatever. Give us a good book.
City for Sale by Jack Newfield and Wayne Barrett. It is essentially the origin story of the 1970s, 80s corruption muck and milieu that Donald Trump came from. And it's sort of the prototype for a lot of what came after, reporting-wise. Can't recommend it enough. It's not the lightest read, but it is a very good read.
There you go. Jonathan.
The closest thing that we've had, and it wasn't that close, but the closest thing that we've had to the present day political and constitutional challenge that we're looking down the pike at right now was, of course, when President Nixon resigned to avoid impeachment and was subsequently pardoned by his successor, President Ford, preempting what I think would have been the inevitable federal charges against him. And there's a great new book out about President Ford by Richard Norton Smith. It's called An Ordinary Man. It is 1-volume biography of Ford, and there's just fantastic new material about Ford's rise to the vice presidency and then Ford's ascent to the presidency when Nixon resigned. And also a lot on the choice he had to make about whether to pardon or not to pardon Nixon, stuff that is all too relevant for this moment.
Excellent. 2 good reads from our guest today. Jeff, play the music.
It's listener mailbag.
I never remember the address you're supposed to send questions to, but I think it's hacksontap@gmail.com. But send your questions. There it is. Hannah helpfully puts it in the Zoom chat. hacksontap@gmail.com if you have a question for us. Maggie, this is a maybe perfect for you. It comes from Bruce. After this, he's a little forward on this. I'm going to warn you. After Trump is convicted in the federal documents case, do you think he will flee the country and seek political asylum in Russia or Saudi Arabia?
So I think that we don't know for sure that he will be convicted in that case. Any number of things can happen. And the Florida jury pool is likely to be a little more favorable to Trump than a Washington one would have been. So I think that answers the next question about which countries he might flee to.
I was struck watching a clip this week of Lindsey Graham suggesting that it would be patently unfair to indict a Republican in Washington, D.C. based on the makeup of what the jury is. Just a little bit of a hot tip out there for your listeners. If you're a little worried about what the jury pool would look like in the place you're committing a crime, my suggestion would be to try just not to commit a crime there. Just as, That's my public service announcement for lawyers. Jonathan, for you, let's go to Steve's question. If Joe Manchin is actually considering a doomed presidential run, we just talked about this as no labels, that could end up giving us Trump 2.0, and he puts in parentheses, the revenge tour. I guess the new concert tour has a name. Would President Biden be wise to offer him an ambassadorship to wherever the hell he wants to go? He doesn't really have a chance in West Virginia for his reelection, but Ambassador Manchin sure does sound nice to me, says Steve. What do you say?
Steve, I like where your head's at, man, because look, I think the smoke-filled room is not a bad thing, okay? It's not a four-letter word in American politics. Deal cutting within political parties, it's a long-standing tradition in this country, and it is not a federal crime to refer to a more topical issue. Look, the fact is, Democrats have a problem on their hand. Joe Manchin wants to stay active in politics. He's got a really difficult reelection. It's not clear he can survive that reelection. And he's tempted to look at running third party.
Yeah.
So if I'm Joe Biden and I'm Chuck Schumer, yeah, I'm going to spend a lot of time with Joe Manchin. I'm going to go down to his boat, almost heaven, TM, and I'm gonna have a nice long chat with Senator Manchin and try to figure out where his head's at and how you can keep him somehow from doing that third party campaign, because it would take votes from people who don't want to vote for Joe Biden again, but can't stomach the thought of voting for Donald Trump either. And so, look, is that an ambassadorship? Is it something involving his alma mater, WVU? Is it something involving his wife? Look, there's ways to be creative here if you're a Democrat, and I'd be surprised, Robert, if they weren't exploring some kind of possibilities, especially if Manchin gets closer and closer to the edge of running third party.
Well, you heard it here. Jonathan's strategy, go to the boat to keep him in the boat.
Boom.
Jonathan, I read this weekend that they're looking for a new basketball coach. Do you think he can coach basketball?
He was a football guy, but look, he can sell. Joe Manchin can sell, man. So if you try to recruit kids, basketball, football, what's the difference,
Yeah. No, it'll be interesting to watch him. He, I mean, you put a microphone in front of him and he never closes an option, which to your point is probably gets him a lot of invitations to do those meetings.
And to also get more microphones in front of his face, I should add too.
Yeah.
I'll ask Keith. Given the advances in AI and deep fakes, if you managed to campaign, how would you handle a deep fake video being released of your candidate doing or saying something disqualifying a few days prior to the election?
Keith, a great question, and I think something that is more and more keeping campaigns, companies, the heads of organizations up late at night trying to think this stuff through. I would say the first thing any good campaign has to do is have a really, really, really good sense of all the things that their candidate has already said. I know there are campaigns that live in fear of, oh, I remember I was edgy in this speech in front of this group and they could have a video of this and blah, blah, blah. Now you don't have to worry about it as much because somebody can just create it out of whole cloth. And we see this stuff, if you're on Twitter at all, you see this stuff pop up, the speech you'd like to hear Joe Biden give or the speech you'd like to hear Donald Trump give and all that stuff. I don't think there's any way to put a lasso around this. I think this is the world that we live in. Have a pretty good sense of what your campaign has said, have a pretty good sense of what your candidate has said, and make sure you're really adroitly out there, particularly in the lead up to the last 5 or 10 days, the last 2 or 3 days, and can push back very quickly on something that pops up. But we are in the Wild West, and AI and deepfakes are going to keep campaigns on their toes for a long, long time, including this campaign cycle. It is primary election day in Virginia. So if you're listening to us from Virginia, go vote. Maggie and Jonathan, thank you for joining us for this edition of Chaos 2024, also known as the Hacks on Tap podcast. Enjoyed talking to you, and I have no doubt that you both will be back soon telling us what's what. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gibbs.
Download this podcast, recommend it to a friend, follow us on Twitter at Hacks on Tap. Go to our YouTube channel, our YouTube page, go to our Facebook page and like us, all of that stuff. Send us a question, all of those things. We love hearing from you. We love the back and forth. We should probably do an episode soon where we just do questions. That sounds like an August one to me, if we can ever get a break. But thanks again for listening. Go to our pages and send us feedback. Thank you to everyone who listened. Some measure of Axe and Murphy and me will be back next week. Hopefully those guys will be off their vacations and back to work.